What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. One of Shakespeare's most famous lines. For centuries, it represented how people thought about language. The message is simple. Words are arbitrary. There's nothing inherently rose-like about the word rose. You could call it a merf, a flibble, or a sporkadoo, and it would still smell exactly the same. In technical terms, this is known as the arbitrariness of the sign. For a long time, many linguists accepted this idea as a basic principle. Words in every language are just labels agreed upon by a community rather than having an intrinsic link to what they describe. But over the last century, researchers have found evidence suggesting that the story may not be so simple. Let's start with an experiment. Which of these words seem larger to you? Mill or mall? For most people, the response is immediate. Mall feels heavier, more substantial. Mill feels smaller, lighter, even more delicate. But why would that be the case? Neither word carries any inherent meaning related to size. So where does that association come from? Back in 1929, an American linguist named Edward Sapir conducted a study that seems almost comical. He asked 500 English-speaking participants to imagine two tables, one large and one small, and he gave them two nonsense words, mill and mall. He asked which belonged to the larger table. Overwhelmingly, people chose mall. And remember, the only difference between these two nonsense words was the vowel. Mill contains the high front vowel I, while mall contains the low back vowel, ah. Sapir repeated this with 60 meaningless word pairs and found the same pattern. All vowel words were linked to larger objects and vowel words to smaller ones. At first glance, these results seem kind of sus. But once we look at the IPA vowel chart, it starts to make more sense. Vowels are classified based on three things: height, backing, and roundness. E is a high and front vowel, front in the mouth, with a smaller oral cavity, while A is low and back with a much larger mouth opening. Sapir argues that this physical articulation influences how we perceive size. This effect can also be seen in real-life applications. For example, marketing researchers tested it using a fake ice cream brand, splitting participants into two groups, telling one group the ice cream was called Frisch, and the other group it was called Frosh. Participants consistently felt that Frosh ice cream was creamier and richer than Frisch ice cream. So it turns out that the vowel differences don't only affect size perception, it also applies to related concepts like richness or heaviness. Given that Edward Sapir is one half of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis of linguistic relativity, the idea that language shapes how we think and perceive the world, you may already be writing off these studies. But it isn't just vowel height. Different consonants also give us different feelings or intuitions. In the same year, 1929, across the Atlantic, a German psychologist named Wolfgang Kohler was testing a very similar phenomenon. Kohler was interested in holism, which suggests the mind processes patterns and whole situations rather than isolated parts. He believed that the brain mapped specific sounds to abstract shapes. To test this, he presented participants with two abstract shapes, one round and one angular or spiky. And he asked them which one should be called Takete and which Maluma. If you're like the overwhelming majority of people, Takete is the spiky shape and Maluma is the rounded one. This has been replicated dozens of times over the past 100 years, most famously in the Kiki and Booba effect by Ramachandran and Hubbard, where 95 to 98% of participants matched Booba to round shapes and Kiki to angular ones. The effect has been observed across many different ages, cultures, and languages from English to Japanese to Swahili, and even in the Himba people of Namibia. Thanks to Sele for sponsoring this video. And speaking of traveling around the world, I recently took my very first trip to Thailand. It was a spontaneous trip, and since it was my first time in the country, I was really glad I had Sele in my back pocket when I landed. What is Sele, you ask? Sele is an eSIM app that gives you mobile data in over 200 destinations worldwide, without expensive roaming fees or the hassle of finding a local SIM. Just download the app, choose a plan, install the eSIM before your trip, and it automatically activates when you land. Like pretty much every millennial, I love traveling, but one of my least favorite parts of arriving in a new country is that brief moment of time when you realize, holy crap, I have no internet. And suddenly you're trying to figure out where you're going, how to get to your hotel, or in the case of China, no internet can literally mean no money. Sele was genuinely a lifesaver during my Thailand trip. I set up everything before I left, and I had data the second I landed. It worked perfectly, and unlike my boyfriend, I didn't have to call my phone carrier to get everything working. If you're traveling soon, download the Sele app and use my code JULESY at checkout for 15% off Sele's many flexible data plans. You can also scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description. Now back to why humans associate different sounds with different abstract shapes. The explanation linguists proposed is surprisingly straightforward. Consonants associated with round shapes include B and M, which are called sonorants, meaning that they're made with continuous, non-turbulent airflow. Other sonorants include nasals like M and N, as well as liquids like R and L. By contrast, sounds like K and T, which were associated with sharp shapes, are voiceless stops produced with abrupt bursts and higher frequency energy. And during production, the mouth also forms a more narrower, more angular shape. So at this point, we have two seemingly different phenomena. One links vowels to ideas like smallness and largeness, while the other links consonants to softness and sharpness. At first glance, they seem unrelated. But in 1994, linguist John Ohala proposed that they may reflect the same underlying principle. Across mammals and birds, larger animals generally produce lower-pitched vocalizations, while smaller animals produce higher-pitched ones. And that's because larger vocal tracts resonate at lower frequencies and smaller vocal tracts resonate at higher frequencies. As a result, animals and humans have evolved to treat pitch as information. Low sounds suggest strength, size, and dominance, and high sounds suggest smallness and vulnerability. So if that's all true, then the associations we make between sounds and concepts like size and strength may all trace back to the same source: biology. Ohala additionally predicted that rising tones often used in questions signal vulnerability and cooperation, while falling pitch signals authority. And as we all know, females are generally smaller than males and tend to have higher voices, mainly due to the fact that the female larynx is roughly 20 to 40% smaller. So biologically, we are predisposed to associate higher pitch with femininity, and Ohala argues that this also connects to higher pitched vowels and consonants. So Ohala predicts that consonants with higher frequency energy, like voiceless fricatives S, sh, and f, and vowels like I, would be associated with smaller and therefore more feminine vocal sources, and the opposite is true for lower frequency sounds. In terms of vowel symbolism, Ohala's theory aligns closely with Sapir's high-low vowel findings if we assume that small corresponds to female and large to male. However, maybe you've noticed, but there is some tension between Ohala and the Kiki-Booba theories. In Ohala's theory, higher pitch is associated with femininity and smallness, but in the Kiki-Booba theory, Sharper, higher frequency consonants tend to be associated with masculinity. So, who's right? In 1990, Cutler, McQueen, and Robinson looked at 1,667 common names in North America and found that male and female names have strikingly different features. Male names were more likely to be monosyllabic and end in non-sonorant consonants and contain lower back vowels. Female names were more likely to be multisyllabic and end in vowels or sonorants like L, M, and R. When male names were multisyllabic, stress tended to fall on the first syllable, like in Thomas, while multisyllabic female names often had stress on a later syllable, like Amanda. So far, we can see support for all of the above theories. Female names tend to have rounder consonants, while male names tend to have lower vowels. Support for both Kiki Buba and Sapir Ohala. But you may be thinking, all of this so far has only been centered around English. You may be wondering if this works in other languages. For example, tonal languages? If Ohala is right, high and rising pitches should generally be associated with femininity, while lower and falling pitches should skew masculine. Mandarin Chinese is ideal to test this out because pitch is built directly into each and every syllable. In 2021, Chen and Kinstowitz looked into this exact phenomenon. At first, the results were almost exactly as predicted. Female names favored sounds like L, M, and N, along with high front vowels. Male names favored back vowels and harsher consonants like P, T, and K, as well as retroflex sounds like zh, ch, sh. Then the researchers looked at tones, and the pattern fell apart. Remember, Ohala's theory states that higher and rising pitch signals femininity, while lower and falling pitch signals masculinity. And those correspond very closely to tones 1, 2, 3, and 4 in Mandarin. The 2021 study found that males actually used more high and rising tones in their names, while females used more low and falling tones in their names, the opposite of what Ohala predicted. And this pattern also appears in research on Cantonese names as well. So, for a moment, it's really looking like tonal languages might completely upend the biological account by Ohala. But then I found an earlier work by Randy LaPala that showed Mandarin speakers judged nonsense syllables with high tones as small and falling tones as large, consistent with Ohala's theory. So it seems that there is some sound symbolism in tonal languages relating to tones, but it's less important in naming, for example. Korean adds another whole layer of complexity. Unlike the languages we've discussed so far, Korean has a long tradition of sound symbolism built directly into the language itself. Korean vowels are divided into light, dark, and neutral categories. Light vowels such as ah and o are associated with brightness, quickness, and smallness. Dark vowels such as ah and u are associated with heaviness, depth, and dullness. There are also neutral vowels like e that fall outside of this contrast. If you've been paying attention so far, you might notice a slight problem. The Korean system predicts almost the exact opposite of what we've seen so far. Throughout the video, low vowels like ah and o have generally been associated with largeness and masculinity. But in Korean sound symbolism, they're associated with smaller and more feminine qualities. So, which patterns show up in Korean names? In 2025, Sullivan and Kong found evidence for both. So female names were more likely to contain the traditionally light vowels ah and o compared to dark vowels ah and u, exactly as Korean sound symbolism would predict. But the vowels they found most often in Korean female names was e, which was a high front neutral vowel. And that seems to match just pretty much across the board what we've seen with female names in other languages. So was Shakespeare right? Well, Sort of. There's still nothing inherently rose-like about the word rose. But after a century of research, it's becoming increasingly difficult to argue that all sounds are equally suited for all meanings. Somehow, certain sounds just seem to fit certain ideas better than others. And exactly how and why that happens remains one of the most debated questions in linguistics. See you next time.